We'd like to welcome you all here to the John F. Kennedy Space Center. My name is Nick Thomas. I'm a communicator here at KSC. And today, we're very pleased and privileged to have with us a woman who's not only flown on board America's space shuttle, but was among the first women selected by NASA to fly as an astronaut. She hometown. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree in chemistry and a doctor of medicine degree from UCLA. Following her graduation in 1976, she commenced a one-year internship at Harvard General Hospital in Torrance, California. She then specialized in emergency medicine and worked in several hospitals in the Los Angeles area. She was selected by NASA as an astronaut in 1978 in the first group of 6 women selected as astronauts. She flew as a mission specialist on STS-51A in 1984, a mission which deployed 2 communication satellites and retrieved 2 others for return to Earth. She served as a robot arm operator on that flight and also became the first mother to fly in space. After a 7-year leave of absence to raise her daughters, she went on to serve as the chief of the Space Station branch of the astronaut office, and more recently, she worked on display development for the Orion spacecraft, America's next generation of manned space vehicle. She retired on April 28, 2017 as the longest-serving astronaut at 36 years and 9 months. And she's with us today to share her remarkable perspective on all this history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Astronaut Anna Fisher.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm so happy to be here with you this morning. I get to be here for the next 6 days speaking to people from all over the world. And it's something I really enjoy, getting the opportunity to come back here to the Kennedy Space Center. It almost feels like I'm coming back home because I've spent so much time here. What I'd like to do today is I'm going to talk to you a bit about my journey of going into space, my flights, a little bit about training, and then I'm going to try to leave some time at the end for a little bit of question and answer. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I was in the first class of astronauts. Well, let me back a little bit. I was 12 years old when I decided I wanted to be an astronaut, listening to Al Shepard's first suborbital launch. But of course, I didn't think that was a very realistic goal. And by the time I went to UCLA for my education, I'd kind of given up that was going to be possible. I did a lot of traveling as a young person. My father was in the Army. I'm an Army brat. And 8th grade, when we wound up settling in San Pedro, as was mentioned, 8th grade was my 13th school. So I had a lot of practice moving around. So I went to UCLA, as was mentioned, became a medical doctor, and really found out about the opportunity to become an astronaut just totally by chance. A conversation with one of my friends that had the NASA newsletter. So I found out like about a month before the deadline, and in June of 1977, and found out that I was being interviewed about 6 weeks after that. I submitted my application, and then in January of 78, found out that I was one of 35 people being selected for the Space Shuttle program for the first time. There were 15 pilots and 20 mission specialists. So there's 2 pathways to become an astronaut. You can either become a pilot, go through the military, be a test pilot, or become a mission specialist with an advanced degree in pretty much any area of science. I was also very fortunate to be in the first group of women ever selected, and it was a real honor to be a part of that group. Dr. Shannon Lucid, Dr. Raider, starting from the left, Dr. Kathy Sullivan, Dr. Judy Resnick, who unfortunately perished on the Challenger accident, myself, and Dr. Sally Wright, the first American woman to fly in space, and also unfortunately passed away in 2012 of pancreatic cancer. So we are based at the Johnson Space Center. Most of from here at the Kennedy Space Center. But this, as you can see, it looks very much like a training facility, a university campus, because the land was donated by Rice University. And at one time it was thought that maybe that land would be, if NASA didn't continue on, because this was back in the early days, would then become a university. When you're first selected as an astronaut, there's a period that's kind of a trial period. For us, it was about a year. For the current classes of astronauts that are training for the International Space Station and some of the commercial crew aspects, it can be as long as 3 years, because one of the hardest things that the new astronauts have to learn is Russian. But for our class, it was a 1-year period, and you're called an astronaut candidate. And as NASA likes to do, they shorten everything into acronyms, and so you are affectionately known as the ASCAMs for a year or so. And once you finish that introductory or trial period, whatever you want to call it, everybody gets their various jobs in the office. For any of you who are in the military, it's kind of like being in a squadron, and then everybody has other jobs, like the training officer, the safety officer. My first job was to work on the area of EVA, extravehicular activity, and spacewalks. At the time, we didn't even have a shuttle suit. This is an Apollo suit. It's a one-piece suit. And they were trying to develop a shuttle suit that would fit someone small enough, fit my size. Turned out that was more difficult than we thought, but it was a great way to start my career as an astronaut and get to work on EVA procedures. And we developed, for example, the tethers that would be used, that are still used actually on board the International Space Station and so forth. So it was a great way to start my career as an astronaut. Then in July of 1983, 2 weeks before my daughter was born, I was assigned to my first space shuttle flight. And one of the neat things that you get to do when you're first assigned to a flight, my commander allowed Dave Walker and I were the rookies on board, so we kind of got to design the concept for our patch. So that was one of the really fun things you do. So we had 2 satellites that represented the 2 satellites we were going to deploy and the 2 satellites that we were going to retrieve. A very exciting mission that I'll share a little bit with you. Then we had 5 stars for the 5 crew members, and I added a 6th star for my daughter Kristen, since I was getting to help design the patch. At about 2 weeks before, training for a shuttle mission was usually somewhere on the order of a year to a little bit over a year, at the most a year and a half, but usually not that long. About 2 weeks before launch, you go to the Kennedy Space Center for a practice count, and that's where this picture was taken with my crewmates. Dale Gardner, who's going to be one of the crewmates who do the spacewalk, our commander right now, Joe Allen, one of the other mission specialists who would also do the spacewalk that I'll talk about myself, and our pilot, Dave Walker. Also at that time, it's the last time that the payload bay doors of the shuttle were open, so it's the last time you could go see your payload or whatever your particular mission was going to be. In our case, we were going to launch 2 satellites. This is a Hughes 376, and it's identical to the 2 satellites that I'm going to show you that were already up in orbit, that the rocket that was supposed to take it to higher orbit failed. And so we were going to rescue them, but it's identical to this one. And then another SYNCOM, a different kind of communication satellite for the U.S. Navy. There's a lot of tradition in the space program, both on the Russian side, even more so on the Russian side. But on the U.S. side, one of the traditional things on launch morning is a feature at breakfast. And as you can see, though, there's not really a lot of food, and although there's some drinks around, you really don't want to drink or eat a lot the morning you're going to launch. And the reason for that is because most astronauts, I would say probably, they say 60%, I wouldn't be surprised if the number's higher than that, suffer from space adaptation syndrome, which is kind of like being seasick. The cause or the etiology is a little different, but it's nausea, malaise, and if you think throwing up on the ground is unpleasant, let me tell you that throwing up in space is much, much worse. So you really want to try to avoid that. And then the other reason you don't want to drink a lot is because you're going to be sitting out on the pad on your back. If you can imagine taking the seat that you're sitting in, putting the back on the floor and having your legs up, you're going to be sitting like that for 3 hours out on the pad. And if you don't drink even a single thing, you are going to have to go to the bathroom really badly. Which is because once you're sitting out on the pad, you cannot unstrap at about 2.5 hours and go to the bathroom. So I launched on the Space Shuttle Discovery, and as I'm looking at this slide, I'm always reminded of what it felt like to stand out there. I was the fourth person to ingress the vehicle and get strapped in. So I had quite a bit of time to stand out there while the commander, pilot, and MS-1, Mission Specialist 1, got strapped in, thinking about what I was about to go do. And it's just a very surreal experience to be standing out there and thinking that you're going to be going into space. This is what it looked like. I flew before the Challenger accident, so basically we wore flight suits pretty much like I'm wearing now, just a different color. And this is where the commander sits, the pilot, Mission Specialist 1, which was Joe Allen, and I was Mission Specialist 2, sitting in this seat. And as you can see, I have a really good view of all the displays and switches and everything. So my job for ascent entry was to be sure that we were on the timeline doing everything we were supposed to do, and if there were a malfunction, to make sure we were executing the correct procedures. And as was also mentioned, I would be the robotic arm operator on orbit. We lifted off on the morning of November 8, 1984. We had a one-day delay because the winds at altitude were too high. And here you see as we're lifting off, and then this is a close-up looking at the configuration of the shuttle. There's the large external tanks providing fuel to the three main engines, the two solid rocket boosters on either side, and there's over 7 million pounds of thrust at liftoff when the shuttle ignitions ignite. So now what I'd like to do is, if you can imagine, as I said, that your seat is back on the floor and you're sitting out on the pad, I'm just going to show you a brief video of what it's like to launch on the space shuttle. At about 10 seconds before launch, the computer sent a command to start the three main engines, except the three main engines to make sure that everything is functioning properly. And when the computer is satisfied, the engines are fine, sends the command to the solid rocket booster. And when the solid rocket booster ignites, you may not know where you're going, but you definitely know you're going somewhere. Very first thing in this slide, there's a lot of vibration, a lot of noise. One of my colleagues described it as driving a pickup truck in the dirt with a bunch of tools rattling around in the back. As the shuttle, the SRBs, the solid rocket boosters, burn for about 2 minutes, and that is called per stage for a shuttle launch. At about a little over 2 minutes into the flight, command was sent by the computers to jettison the solid rocket boosters. They fall to the ocean, they have parachutes, and are recovered by the teams here at the Kennedy Space Center and reused. The shuttle then continues on the three main engines for about another 6.5 minutes. And after that, once the solid rocket boosters are gone, the ride is as smooth as glass, just a constant acceleration. You go from 0 miles per hour to 17,500 miles per hour in 8.5 minutes. At about 6 to 6.5 minutes, you're experiencing about 3 Gs, which means like if you weigh 100 pounds here on the ground, you would weigh briefly about 300 pounds, but the Gs are through your chest, so it's a little hard to breathe, but really not that uncomfortable. And then in an instant, the minute the computer sent the command to shut off the main engines, you go from 3 Gs to 0 Gs just in a second. And you can almost feel the blood in your legs that normally pools in your legs shifting to your central venous system. And if you look at pictures of astronauts, the first was fluid chest, it's really great because it gets rid of all your wrinkles. Unfortunately, they all come back later on. But, so now what I'd like to do, although the shuttle isn't flying anymore, I'd just like to share with you a little bit about what it was like to live and work on board the space shuttle. And because a lot of the things are similar, whether you're going to talk about one of the new spacecraft that we're building or whether we're talking about the International Space Station, there's a lot of commonality because we learned a lot from being on the shuttle. One of the things that the shuttle had was a lot of checklists. We have checklists for everything. That particular checklist you see here is our crew activity plan, which was our Bible on board. the shuttle, because it told us what we were going to be doing every minute of our flight. Everything was color-coded. Red was for the commander, yellow for the pilot, blue for MS1, green for MS2. That way, when you looked at a checklist or you looked at some food that was in a package or whatever, you could immediately tell whose it was without having to read anything. The shuttle is like a two-story, little tiny apartment, if you will. The upper flight deck looks very much like a conventional commercial jet cockpit. And there were over 2,000 switches and circuit breakers and stuff in the shuttle, most of them being up on the flight deck. The new vehicle being designed for example, Orion, it's only going to have in the order of maybe 25 or 30 switches and so forth. And those are really only for emergency backups because the entire vehicle will be controlled via the displays that was mentioned in the introduction that we were working on. So a very different concept for the newer vehicles. Then the aft portion or the back portion behind where you saw Commander Rick sitting in his seat is where most of the work took place on board the shuttle. Of course, once you get on orbit, you don't really need the seats that we were sitting on, so we can fold those up and we could stow them on either side because now we had more room to work. And this is a panel from which the commander could fly the shuttle. In our case, we were going to rendezvous with the satellites, and then later flights they would dock with the International Space Station. And from this panel over here, I would operate the robotic arm. And you can see we have windows looking out into the payload bay right here, and then these two windows. In general, the shuttle flew inverted with the windows facing down to the Earth, unless there was some other reason why we couldn't fly that way, so that we could look at the Earth and take a lot of neat pictures. Then there's a mid-deck below, and the mid-deck below is where everything else happened. You can see that I'm holding on to the handle of our treadmill. This was a food warmer that we had for heating up our food. We each had a locker. That's where all of our lockers, where all of our equipment was stowed. So we each had our own personal locker, as I said, and the things are color-coded, so you knew immediately that was mine. And here you can see I'm demonstrating space hair, such thing as flathead or bedhead hair on orbit. And I'm wearing a necklace, actually, the same necklace that I'm wearing right today. And then we had, pictures of our families and where we went to school, what military branch we served in, all that sort of stuff. After a couple of days, I felt like I was back in my dorm room at UCLA. A little bit about the food on space in orbit. The food was very much like backpacking food. I really wasn't hungry for about 2 days. I was one of the ones that had space adaptation syndrome. And although I never really threw up or felt really terrible, I didn't feel great, and I wasn't hungry, so I basically didn't eat anything other than just a little snack for about 2 days. I woke up on the morning of the third day, and I was absolutely starving. I had, my first thing I wanted to eat was a hot dog. It was the best hot dog I've ever eaten, probably also the most expensive. And calculate, weight to orbit and all that sort of stuff. But the food basically was like backpacking food, and you can see here I'm drinking, looks like hot chocolate or coffee, looks like a breakfast. We would have a tray, and we would take turns making the meals and adding water, rehydrating. You can see here's a straw, and it has a check valve on it because you certainly don't want any fluids getting out and getting into your electronics. But the food was good. My other favorite food was the beef stroganoff. It was really good. A little bit about sleeping in space. I still remember, even all these years later, how strange it felt the first night I got on orbit. Because I really felt like I wanted a pillow or somewhere to put my head. But you really don't have to. The 3 crewmates that flew previous missions, they really didn't want to use their sleeping bags. These are actually sleeping bags that you can get inside, and it has holes for your arms to go out. And if you go on the internet, you can see crews that use those to kind of wedge myself between 2 sleeping bags and make it kind of like a little hammocky arrangement. I just felt a little more secure that way and slept better. But this picture was taken on the 8th day as we're packing up, getting ready to go home. I was taking a little power nap, and you can see I'm just sleeping, floating, and I'm just tethered to the handle of that treadmill. So you can really just sleep anywhere. It's just more that it's disorienting if you fall asleep in one place and then float and wake up somewhere else. Plus you annoy your crewmates, so you really don't want to do that. So a little bit, everybody wants to know how you go to the bathroom in space, but nobody wants to ask. So here you see Dave Walker as he's getting ready. Hopefully he's just simulating the waste management system on board the shuttle. Very much like a porta potty that you'll see, at a festival or music festival or whatever. And it uses vacuum suction to help things along. And so with that, I'll let you leave the rest to your imagination. When we started flying Next Gender Cruise, we added this privacy curtain, but as you can see, you really don't have a lot of privacy, and so you get to know your crewmates very well, perhaps better than you want to. So a little bit about what we did on our flight, because this was a really exciting mission. NASA had never done anything like this before. Nobody had ever brought hardware back from space, and particularly not hardware as large as this. The only thing we'd ever brought back were the lunar rocks from the Apollo mission. So we launched 2 satellites on day 2 and day 3. Day 4 was the day that we were getting ready to go do these 2 very long days where we were going to do spacewalks, get the satellites back. Day 4 was the day we prepared, checking out all our sensors, checking out the spacesuits. And then on day 5 and then on day 7, we rescued the Palapa and the Westar satellites that had been launched on an earlier shuttle mission in February of 1984. Here you see my crewmate, Dale Gardner, with the manned maneuvering backpack flying over to the satellite. And you have to realize these satellites were not designed to be retrieved. They had solar arrays all around them. They're very fragile. So there's really no way to grab them, and they weren't designed, they didn't have a grapple. In order to use a robotic arm, you need to have a grapple fixture to grab it, and of course there wasn't one on the satellite, so we had to figure out a way to get a grapple fixture on this device called the Stinger, so that I could grab it with a robotic arm. And then we wound up changing that a little bit while we were on orbit. We wound up, as I operated the arm, Joe Allen was on the end of the arm and he grabbed the satellite, and then Dale, after he brought it over to him, would release. And it was pretty exciting. A lot of these things that we got to do. Wouldn't have traded me on that mission for anything in the world. Now we had to figure out how to hook the satellites into the payload bay so that they didn't come loose, because of course that would have been catastrophic during entry. So we had to attach another piece of hardware to the bottom that would hook it into the payload bay. So finally, at the end of the second spacewalk, here we are, and my crewmates brought out their little for sale sign, which was kind of a joke, but not entirely, because the insurance underwriters, Lloyd's of London, and some other companies in the United States, were really very happy about getting these satellites back, and they were refurbished and then launched about 3 years later. By that time, the Challenger accident had happened, and so they were launched by the Chinese government. So then we had our last day on orbit, packing up, getting ready to go home, and we did our deorbit burn on the morning of the 9th day. Here you see it, we're getting ready to enter. This is a shot a friend of mine took as we went overhead in Houston, and then we landed at the Kennedy Space Center. We were the second flight of Discovery and the second landing of the space shuttle at the Kennedy Space Center. And we were met by customs officials asking if we had anything to declare. So here we are. I remember when we touched down, I felt like an 800-pound gorilla. And we were all very unsteady. You can see we're all holding on very tightly to the railings as we're walking out. Later flights, they no longer had to do that, which was probably a good thing. And then we landed about 7:30 in the morning, and we came back over here to crew quarters just down the road, took a shower, went back home, and was probably back in Houston about 2 or 3 that afternoon. I cannot tell you how surreal an experience it is to be in space in the morning and back home and in your house in your bed that night. It's quite surreal. So with that, I thought I would just get my time here. Do I have a little more time, Nick, or do I need to stop?
Oh, go ahead.
I'll just show you a few minutes. Sorry, I always get very excited about what I'm talking, and I'm always running over. So I just want to show you a bit about the beautiful shots in space. Every photographer tries to capture a perfect sunrise or sunset. And when you're in space, it takes 90 minutes to go around the Earth. And so you can see a sunrise or a sunrise, a sunset or a sunrise every 45 minutes. And they are spectacular. This is the Aurora Borealis. This is looking into the Mediterranean. This is the Sinai Peninsula. And one of the things you'll hear every astronaut or cosmonaut say is that, you know, from space you don't see any borders. And I know I'm trivializing history and all of that, but it does seem when you look at our planet from space that all the conflicts we have, you know, kind of seem sad and meaningless in a way, because it's such a beautiful planet that we have. And if you look into the blackness of space, you know, you really think we should appreciate it and appreciate the short time we have here. This is the Himalayas. And then the views in the daytime are amazing, but the nighttime views are spectacular. This is looking at Greece, Tokyo and Tokyo Harbor, the Nile Delta, and it's indeed Africa at night is just a very dark continent with the exception of the lights along the Nile River. As contrasted to the United States, here we're lit up like a Christmas tree. This is the Florida looking up the eastern seaboard, and we launched with a full moon so you can see the moon reflecting on the ocean. This is Los Angeles. I see my home right down here. Right, and then this is Houston. The Kennedy Space Center, right here, where you see the two launch pads, 39A being the vertical assembly building, and the 15,000-foot runway. And again, to go from the west coast to the east coast, just like ascent, takes about 8.5 minutes or so, to give you an idea. And then I just really like looking at this shot of Europe with the huge labels, so I don't have to try to remember them all. And then I just love this shot of the River of Italy. So, with that, I really don't have time to talk about all the rest of these things. I'd like to end right there. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing about some of my experiences, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Yeah, if you have any questions.
Hi. What's the weather like? Were you cold? Were you hot?
Oh, well, actually, that's a funny question. Well, basically, it's like your house. You have your thermal control system, and you can regulate it and set the temperature. But the reason it's a funny question, my crewmate Gail Gardner and I had a kind of running battle the entire, as I'm sure some of you can relate to who are married. And I liked it a little colder, so I get up in the middle of the night and I turn colder. And he was sleeping in the airlock, which, as it turned out, was probably one of the colder places on board the shuttle. So in the middle of the night, he'd get up and they get warmer and stuff. And this went on for a couple of days until my other crewmate, Dave Walker, decided to solve this. And he took one of these elephant trunk kind of things that can route air out of the airlock up to the flight deck. So the next morning we woke up and everybody was happy, except Rick, our commander, said, we all said, you know, how did you sleep? He said, well, it was really great, except my feet were freezing. From having the air up to where his feet were. Anyway, funny question, but basically you can control the temperature.
Where did he astronaut when she grows up?
That's a great question, Cindy. I tried really hard to brainwash them, but my oldest daughter is in broadcast journalism. She would love to be the first broadcast journalist to go into space and report from space, but she didn't want to be a career astronaut. And my younger daughter went into finances, so I have no idea exactly what she does. but my granddaughter, who I just turned 11 months, about to turn a year, she already has 2 flight suits, 2 flight jackets, so I'm doing my best.
Okay, question right here.
So, the vision of Challenger is still very vivid. You watched it through school. I'm curious how it impacted you, obviously, knowing the numbers, and how would that affected you if you were flying after them versus before?
Well, it had direct impacts on me in terms of my career, and I'll mention that. But it didn't impact me in terms of flying. I knew what the risks were, and I understood it, even though I flew before Challenger. I think we all knew that something like that would happen eventually someday. I think my only regret about Challenger and Columbia is that they were both preventable accidents as you look back at them. I think we all understand there's risks, and sometimes things break, something happens. But both of those accidents, if you study them and everything, were really due to poor decision making. And so that's the part I find hardest. It impacted me directly in that I was about 6 weeks from my second flight when Challenger happened. We decided to have our second daughter, and I found out that 2 children is a lot more work than more than twice having one, trying to work and having a very demanding job. And so I wound up taking leave of absence and coming back, which is another long story, which for any of you who go to lunch with an astronaut, I talk about all those personal things at my lunch talk that I don't have as much time here talking about. So it impacted me pretty much directly in terms of my career. But in terms of the knowledge that you was going to do something risky, even though it hadn't happened yet, we all knew that that was a possibility.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions.
Yes, what would the height minimum be to go into the program?
It was 5% female to 95% male was what and I think, do you know how tall Mary Cleve is? She's probably 5.
Mary is
maybe?
5 and change. 5
And she's probably the smallest, the shortest of all the astronauts. And there were some issues for her with getting some of the equipment to fit and everything. But about 5 feet is probably about the smallest you could be.
It takes to get to the moon from the Earth.
Say again?
How long does it take to get to the moon from the Earth?
About 3.5, 4 days, something like that. You know, kind of depends what the particular trajectory is. But I firmly believe that we should go back to the moon before we try to go to Mars. At the moment, going to Mars, well, I think they launched the Mars Insight in January, and it just arrived to give you, so it's a several-month process. You know, we're still working at what the propulsion would be, and you know, there might be other ways to go faster. But it's definitely a lot better to be 3.5, 4 days from home than 6 months or so from home, as we're learning how to live on another body or planet or whatever. So, you know, that's my personal opinion, but hopefully it looks like that's what the rest of the community agrees with as well.
Now we're going to set up with a photo opportunity with Anna. Out in the lobby, we're going to set you up into a single file line. Please have your cameras ready. I'll be glad to take